Welcome, friends, to another Global Capitalism. This is a presentation we offer every other month, and by we I mean Democracy at Work and the Left Forum. We've been doing this for some years, and we're proud to be able to continue to do it here and now. And here and now is September of the year 2025. And the title of this lecture is The Decline of the Empire Accelerates. And I'm motivated to bring this presentation to you because many folks have been asking me to present an overview that really makes the case for why I see this as an empire in decline. And that especially because the leaders of the United States, from President Trump on down, are very busy speaking and acting as though the empire was fine, as strong as ever, as powerful, if not more so, than ever. In other words, to present literally the opposite of what I am going to be arguing is the case. And since for the whole world it is important to distinguish between the presentation of the United States' leadership and the reality with which that leadership has to deal, as does the whole world, I think this presentation will be interesting. I'm dividing it into two parts. The first part is the position of the United States in the world economy. You might call it the foreign part of the story. And then I'll switch and focus on the domestic aspects of empire decline. So we begin with the foreign. And I'm going to begin particularly with a commentary on a very important meeting at the end of August of this year in Beijing, China, in which the leaders of Russia, China, and India, as well as other BRICS members, have been getting together to really talk, and probably for the first time since it began, about the implications of President Trump's trade and tariff war against the rest of the world. And I think that meeting is emblematic of a fundamental change in the position of the United States in the world economy, which can be summarized by the phrase empire decline. I'll begin with statistics that I've presented before, but are even more relevant now. India and China are the two biggest countries in the world. India recently outstripped China and became the single largest by population country in the world. China, India, Russia, and many other countries are now members of a BRICS alliance, and they are increasingly meeting and organizing to develop their economies in relationship to one another. Their payment systems, the currencies they will use to settle trade between and among them, the focus on one another's markets as exports and imports increase among them, the simple statistics of adding up the GDPs, the gross domestic products, of the BRICS countries, all of them, gives you about 35% of the world's total output of goods and services. In comparison, the United States and its major allies, the G7, that's the United States, Canada, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, and Britain, the G7 add up all their GDPs, about 28% of the world. What does that mean? It means that the BRICS countries, and among them the powerhouse is China, just as among the G7 the powerhouse is the United States. It means that that powerhouse is now the bigger, richer part of the world economy. But it isn't only GDP that matters here. Other dimensions matter. So let's turn to the all-important question of population. The strength, the power, the future of an economy depends on how many people it has, how well it educates and develops them, how healthy they are physically and mentally, and all the rest. The population of the United States alone is 4.5% of the world. If you add the G7, maybe 10, maybe 15% of the world. But the BRICS is over half of the world's population. There is no contest. That part of the world, which is now developing its schools, its universities, its public health system, its transportation systems, quickly to levels that are greater in their efficiency, in their speed, than those here in the United States. A quick comparison of the rapid rail system in China with that in the United States, for those of you that might be interested, will summarize this difference in a very dramatic way. In other words, we are no longer, we in the West, the center of the world economy as we had been on many levels for several centuries. Centuries marked by the domination of large portions of Asia, Africa, and Latin America by the advanced Western capitalist core of the global economy. We were the center, the rest was the hinterland, the third world, and the various other phrases used to show what the ranking was. All of that is now over, and it isn't coming back. The gap between the G7 as a source of wealth and the BRICS is a gap widening in favor of the BRICS, and it has been doing that for the last 5 years without interruption. The result is staggering. This is now the wealthy part of the world, the BRICS. They are becoming militarily and politically assertive, as goes with that kind of wealth. Just as for the United States, it wasn't important as a colony of Britain. It had to become independent. It had to be able to develop its own economy, and then eventually it replaced Britain as the empire of the world. Britain's empire was formal colonies. The United States' empire was informal colonialism. And that is now over. It is extremely important to understand this. However tempted Americans may be to deny it, to pretend that it isn't there, or if they even admit it, to pretend it doesn't matter, to wave away the BRICS with a gesture of dismissal, the way President Trump recently did, that won't make it go away, and that doesn't change anything. It's important to understand that for every country in the world now, for every corporation or business that is engaged in international trade now, it is a time of adjustment, recognizing that the future, like the present, is much more tilted towards China and the BRICS than towards the United States and the G7. This is an important adjustment going on, changing the strategic decisions, where to invest, what to invest in, how to organize a supply chain. That's all being redone. not, as you might imagine, in response to the latest tariff Mr. Trump has related. That's what you read about. But much more important than the herky-jerky up and down of tariffs, the short-term matter is the long-term matter, and that is the global shift from the United States and the G7 on the one hand to focus on China and the BRICS. That's where markets will grow. That's where the new inventions, new ways of doing things, new products, that's where they're going to be coming from more and more. We have learned that time is on their side, and that hasn't changed. How has the United States handled this situation? Well, as I've already hinted to you, and as I'm going to show you now, by a combination. A combination, on the one hand, of denial. I'm using that in the psychological sense of the word. Literally pretending that everything I just said and all that goes with it isn't happening, or isn't happening that much, or hasn't reached its peak, or 100 ways of negating, of denying what it is I just said. But denial rarely happens all by itself. People who deny what's happening to them usually come up with an alternative explanation, something they can say to others and themselves to comfort them and to give them the sense that the denial of everything I've said is a reasonable position for them to take. And yes, the American government and much of American public opinion has gathered around an alternative story, an alternative analytic, so that they can sustain their denial of the changed global economic reality. And what is the story they tell? Well, in a way, you already know it if you've been paying attention, so I'm going to summarize it, but count on you already knowing many parts of it. The basic story is that the United States remains the rich and powerful, all the rest, but that its position in the world has been abused. The United States is a victim. It is a victim of the bad behavior of other countries and of other people. So we have, on the one hand, the awful people who have come into our country to take advantage of our wealth and our success, the immigrants. And so we have an enormous political upheaval around the demonization of the immigrants. They may look like among the poorest people in the world, shaken out of their countries of origin by warfare, by climate change, by suffering that is obvious, with their few belongings trudging, hopefully, towards the border into the United States. And here, when they come, we are now arresting them. We have a whole new national police force, ICE, whose job it is to terrorize these folks, to arrest them, and often the wrong people too, so that the terrorization by Americans of Americans is building in this country. And I'll have more to say about that a little later. The demonization of the immigrants is a process of blaming other people. Well, what are they being blamed exactly for? It's a little difficult in the United States because the people doing the blaming are the direct descendants of immigrants. And we're only talking 2 or 3 generations back, not that long. What is going on here is a transformation of the consciousness to literally blame 12 to 15 million undocumented immigrants, poorest people amongst us, doing the lowest paid jobs in this economy, as if they were the reason why an economy of 330 million people is in trouble. It is, on the face of it, preposterous and should have been understood. But if you're needy, if what you need is to cover your denial, well, then you won't be so careful or so choosy about what stories you adopt. Well, what is it that they're being blamed for? They're being blamed for the fact that an enormous part of American economic life, huge portion of our working class, has really been badly treated over the last 30 to 40 years, suffered loss of jobs, loss of income, loss of position in society that came from being the best paid workers in the manufacturing sector of the world's richest country, which is what these people were for most of the second half of the 20th century, indeed for most of the 20th century. What happened to white men working in manufacturing in this country over the last 40 years is indeed a horror story. Their jobs were taken from them as their employers moved the location of those jobs out of the United States to be relocated in Asia, Africa, Latin America, where the wages were much cheaper and therefore the profits greater. No one put a gun to these capitalists' head and said, "You must move." Not at all. They did it because it was profitable. And it had as one of its results the most spectacular increase in the stock markets of the United States in our country's history. The second thing those capitalists did was replace workers with automation machinery of one kind or another. Above all, the computers, the robots, and now artificial intelligence. And finally, there were some immigrants brought in who could and would work for less than native-born Americans. When you put together the relocation of jobs in manufacturing out of the country, automation, and immigration, you can then account for the savage deduction in the wages and jobs and living conditions of white men workers above all others. They really suffered, no question. The cause of their suffering, the profit motive of capitalism. Just as capitalists were once concentrated in New England and then moved to the Midwest, leaving New England bereft, and then left the Midwest, which we now call the Rust Belt in this country, to move to the far West. Eventually, they move out of the country. The same logic driving them at each step. And they've now moved out. And they don't care what happened to New England. They don't care what happened to the Rust Belt. And they don't care what happens in the United States. They're busy making money. And if you're rich enough to own shares of stock, you participate in the rising profits, which is what the top 10% of this country have enjoyed. That is why if you speak to them, you'll get a very different story from the one I'm telling, because it puts the blame where it belongs, on the system and the profit motive that runs that system. That's the reality. But blaming the foreigner is the convenient story. So we blame the immigrants and avoid telling the context, which explains why they're even there. And it shouldn't be seen as a strength either. Expelling immigrants, deporting them by the millions, which is current policy in the United States, admits that what made America great, which was bringing in waves of immigrants, remembering the basic rule that when an immigrant arrives and he or she goes to work, They always produce more for their employer than the employer pays them in a wage. That more is the employer's profit, and that's what he hires them for. So the immigrant always produces more than the immigrant consumes, and that more builds the economy. America's greatness was based on absorbing immigrants. Deporting them now is a sign that this economy cannot anymore absorb them productively. That's not a fault of theirs. That's a failure of the capitalist system. It's part of its decline. Well, it wasn't only the immigrants that got blamed. Mr. Trump, who rose to power as the spokesperson for those angry white males in manufacturing, who were so badly treated by both Republican and Democratic governments, who longed and looked for something new and different, which Mr. Trump was. He's now taking this fortunate opportunity that he became president on the basis of it. He's now extending it. He's blaming all the foreigners around the world for the difficulties of the American empire. If you listen to Mr. Trump, and I would urge you to do it, you hear a story about the whole world is cheating us. To explain his tariffs, he says, you see, I'll pick in a country, Vietnam sells more to us than we can sell to them. That's a bad thing. It is. That's their fault. It is. Wait a minute. What Americans buy from Vietnam, they buy because they want to and because they are rich enough to do it. Vietnam doesn't buy as much from the United States because they're not a rich country and their people don't have the money with which to buy American goods. The reason there's an imbalance is because we are rich and they are poor. And then we blame them for our difficulties. We're blaming the poor for not doing what they can't afford to do. It's crazy to do that, blaming the others. The United States buys more from the world than it sells. That's why dollars accumulate all over the world. That's why the dollar is the global currency, because Americans, for decades, have purchased more than they produce as an economy. Now, you don't have to denounce that. It's not exactly an achievement. You're living way beyond your means. Your people buy from the rest of the world, and they give in exchange little green pieces of paper that say $1 on them. To blame the rest of the world because we buy all of that is a bizarre move, but it makes sense if your purpose is to cover over your denial that something is going wrong now. What's going wrong is that the rest of the world doesn't want to be in the subordinate position to the United States that it was from 1945 until 2010 or 2015. That's what's changing. That's what's causing the BRICS to emerge as what they are. But Mr. Trump is going to blame the others. He's going to hit the whole world with tariffs. He's going to make it very clear, if you pay attention, that the tariff is a punishment. You have abused us. Very important to tell that story, and we're now punishing you. Is that what's actually going on? No. But that's the story that has to be told. What is it that's actually going on? Something completely different. The United States took advantage over the last 50 years, basically since the 1970s, of its own position in the world by arranging to buy from the rest of the world and to give them in exchange those little cheap green pieces of paper called the US dollar, which cost nothing to produce. So the French would work and make wine and send it here, and the Japanese would work and make enormously interesting electronic equipment and sell it here, and on and on and on. And we would give them these green pieces of paper. Very good deal for the United States. Cost nothing to produce the paper, and we get real stuff that human labor had to produce. But it's even better. What did those foreign countries do with the green pieces of paper? If you hold the paper, it does nothing for you. You just can look at it. So what they did is they lent it back to the United States government, those extra dollars. And that allowed the United States government to spend more than it had to raise in taxes from you and me if we are Americans. Instead of taxing us even more, they could borrow, which they did. They borrowed and they borrowed and they borrowed. For the American government, this was wonderful. So they kept doing it. Today, we have a national debt of $36 trillion, and the rest of the world is saying, wait a minute, this system has to stop. We're getting into dangerous territory. We don't want to keep lending to a government that's borrowing too much, because the day might come when that government says we can't pay it back. It's a problem all creditors have facing their debtors. The United States is the largest debtor country in the world right now. Japan and China are the numbers 1 and 2 major lenders to the United States. And they don't want to lend anymore. Nor do most of the rest of the world. It's too dangerous. So what is the government here going to do? It could go and tax its own people, but the American people would be outraged and vote out of office any politician who did that. So they keep on borrowing, but they can't keep on. What are they going to do? Mr. Trump came up with an answer. He is going to make the rest of the world pay so that the government doesn't have to borrow so much. That's what the tariffs are for. He wants somehow to raise the money, so he imposes a tariff. True, it has to be paid by the American company that brings the goods in, but the hope is that the foreigner who makes the goods, who will worry about the rising price now that Americans have to pay a tariff, will lower the cost of the product so that the price doesn't have to go up so much here, so it won't lose that much business. Is that a long shot? You bet. Are foreign producers going to play along? I don't think so. I think they're going to look for every conceivable way to get around these tariffs, to move their trade to other countries that don't impose such tariffs, to retaliate to the United States with tariffs of their own in the hopes that that will bring down the American focus on tariffs. But meanwhile, Mr. Trump is raising money to try to offset the borrowing he can't do. You understand? These are acts of desperation by a society that is having too many problems, can't quite solve them, solves one of them by aggravating another one, and then looks around and realizes it's not that far ahead with the new one being worse. That's what we have here in the United States. It goes so far that Mr. Trump, who believes all of this story that he has to tell, and you shouldn't be surprised that these stories of the evil foreigner who has hurt the United States are so comfortable in Mr. Trump's mouth. He believes them. It's the old story. You keep telling these stories often enough, you may not convince others, but you'll probably convince yourself by the mere repetition. And here's how far it goes. In Brazil, where there's a legal process against the previous leader there, Mr. Bolsonaro, Mr. Trump has directly inserted himself and connected tariffs as a punishment because he doesn't like how the government today is prosecuting the government of the past. We used to call that interference in the internal affairs of another country. That's what he's doing. And why is he doing that? Because the Brazilians are evil. What? And why is that? Well, he tried to say, well, they're making us run a deficit. They're not buying as much, until one of his advisors showed him that the Brazilians are actually buying more from Americans than we are buying from them. Well, then he had to find something else, which he did. They are not treating Mr. Bolsonaro right. This is no longer interesting for what it says. It's interesting for what it shows. The determination to blame others for the declining empire of the United States. One last point. To drive home the same story, Mr. Trump likes to say leaders from various countries are coming to Washington to sit down and beg for me to either lower or remove the tariffs. He boasts. This is what white American workers like to see. It's not them that are suffering. It's the bad people who did it to us, who are humiliated by having to come and beg our great leader to not punish them as much as he has. Well, let me assure you that the diplomats going to Washington, and who are indeed begging, he's right about that, they are not happy doing that. In China, they call this kind of thing 100 years of humiliation. That's the way most ex-colonial countries feel about it. Will they come for the short-run relief you might get from begging? Yes. If you think that's all they're doing, you don't understand. They are now recognizing, and this is crucial, that the United States is no longer what it was since 1945. The rich, powerful, stable society that you could count on. Yes, you'd keep your money there. Yes, you'd look for markets to sell because they would be secure. They would be safe. You'd look for sources of inputs you needed because buying from America was reliable. All of that is gone. Mr. Trump is teaching the world that the United States is not a place you can afford to sell to because they will hit you with a tariff anytime they feel like it. You can't afford to do business in the United States. Maybe a little, but you cannot become dependent because if you are, you're not facing the humiliation your diplomats are going through this week in Washington. And so every company, as I mentioned before, every country is looking now to find ways in the months and years to come to lessen their interactions with the United States, lessen their dependence, find other customers, find other sources, invest and keep their money someplace else. Here's the way to summarize this if you're willing to face the reality. By reacting to the decline of our empire, by not admitting it, by punishing others, immigrants, and the rest of the world with an endless threat and reality of damaging tariffs, it is a process of isolating the United States. And that will affect everybody on this planet, given the role that the United States once had, the world shaped around the extraordinary power of the United States in the second half of the 20th century, the unwinding of that, the isolation of the United States following from the policies of the United States itself, as I've tried to show you, will be the remarkable story of the 21st century we are living through. And if you want to see signs of the isolation, what's the one country on earth that still supports what Israel is doing in Gaza? The United States, with its money and its weapons. No one else, not even the Europeans who used to, can stomach it anymore. That's just the tip of an iceberg. The attempt to punish India right now for the fact that it buys oil from Russia, something India has been doing, buying from Russia oil and other things for a long time, is understood, not just by Mr. Modi, the leader there, but by everybody watching as another attempt to punish another country for doing what it is in its interest. Whatever short-term gain you might get out of that, and so far none is visible, the long-term change that is producing is symbolized by Mr. Modi's going to China at the end of August to meet with Putin and Xi Jinping and the others. Wake up, America. What is happening is in your interest not to deny anymore. Let me turn finally to the domestic signs, evidences of all of this, because they are as glaring and as obvious, really, as are the foreign ones. First, we are continuing to deepen the inequality here in the United States. For the last 40 years, we have experienced nothing less than a massive redistribution of wealth and income from the bottom and the middle to the people at the very top, the people who count their billions by the tens and the hundreds, who sit at the top of American society like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. On the 20th of January, when Mr. Trump was inaugurated, on the platform where he swore to be the next president, sitting in a row on the chairs, were the richest billionaires in the United States. Not the greatest contributors to American culture, not the greatest athletes, the greatest actors, the greatest poets. No, the billionaires. They're the ones who represent what became the government of the United States. Mr. Trump was signaling who are the most important people to him. If you look at the American stock market, one of the reasons it is doing well is that 8 companies, the companies whose executives were sitting behind Mr. Trump, account for most of the wonderful performance of the stock market. The average stock doesn't. The economy is more and more the government merging with the top corporate executives. And in recent weeks, we've seen it take a new step. The United States government did take a 10% position in the Intel Corporation, one of the great high-tech companies of this country, is now largely owned, big block of shares, another 5% is available for the government to get. They'll give it 15%, usually enough to control a corporation. That merger of government and enterprise, you know where we find that in the history of the last 100 years? In Germany, in Italy. That's called fascism in economics. NVIDIA and AMD just agreed in exchange for a license from the government to sell their chips in China, they'll give the government 15% of the revenue that generates for them. Suddenly, all the security concerns are out the window. We're now getting money for the government, so it doesn't have to borrow and it doesn't have to tax other people. It's going to become an actor. That means if the unions in these companies strike, they'll be striking against the government. What will it do? Will it use troops to put down the workers now that it's part owner of it all? I don't know, but the government is using troops in Los Angeles, Washington, Chicago, and New York against the will of the people who live there and the politicians those people elected to office. The use of the military to enforce what a merged government and leading corporations are doing, that's fascism, economically speaking. The growing inequality is eroding the purchasing power of the American people. And one of the reasons they voted for Mr. Trump was the inflation that happened under Mr. Biden, the previous president. If Mr. Trump allows the inflation to emerge, he may be committing political suicide. But he's desperate. Let me say it again. He's desperate. He's beginning to fear, as the entire financial press of the United States admits, that in the second half of 2025, most of which is still ahead of us as I speak to you, we face an economy that may go into recession, or that may go have another inflation, or that may have both of them at the same time, stagflation. Any one of those outcomes undercuts a large part of the political base for Mr. Trump. And yet, his attack on the Federal Reserve, our central bank, demanding that they cut interest rates when they don't want to do that yet, will provoke even more inflation, which risks undoing him. Why would he do that? Because he's desperate. An economic downturn now would risk driving Mr. Trump out of office and therefore jeopardizing the tariff program and much else, because the Democrats coming in to replace Mr. Trump would likely undo what he did in a manner rather similar to the way he's been undoing what the previous President Biden did. And then the growing splits in this country. White supremacy has been revived by the Trump administration. That's part of its political base. And that, of course, aggravates race relations in this country that are a problem, as they have been for many, many years. No one knows exactly where that's going, except we all know here it's not going in a good direction. The signs of it are everywhere. I am speaking to you from New York City. Earlier this year, the majority party in this city, the Democratic Party, had a primary to select a candidate to run for mayor of New York City, the largest city in the United States. It's a very important position. The young man who won the Democratic primary, Zohran Mamdani, is a self-defined socialist. He doesn't want capitalism at all. And he's far ahead. At this point, he is the odds-on favorite to be the next mayor, because the existing mayor has no chance at all, and the old, standard, traditional Democratic politician, Andrew Cuomo, is looked down upon by a huge portion of the electorate. Now, I don't know at this point what the election outcome will be. That's in the first week of November. But at this point, it's already clear that something remarkable is going on. New York City, for example, has a very large Jewish population. Mr. Mamdani supports the Palestinians and is against what Israel is doing in Gaza, and he won the Jewish vote too. That vote expresses an alienation of huge numbers of people from the Trump agenda and the Trump presidency. In Texas, they're maneuvering their districts to defeat Democrats and kick them out. In California, the governor there is doing the opposite in response to Texas. These are levels of the country falling apart that we haven't seen for a very, very long time. And they are all signs of a declining capitalist empire that does not know how to cope with all of its problems other than by demonizing immigrants, demonizing foreigners, punishing the world with tariffs. You know, people ask me, where will this go? Well, in the end, the United States is continuously being frustrated. Mr. Trump promised to end the war in Ukraine in a matter of days. He's failed to do that. He promised to end the horror in Gaza. He's failed to do that. He bombed Iran, which means he's adding war, not canceling it. These are acts of desperation. He can't control what's happening. Will he turn to the military option? Will he turn to nuclear weapons? I don't know. The whole world, in a sense, is holding its breath about that. But time is now on the side of China, India, Russia, and the BRICS. Their importance is growing as that of the United States and the G7 are shrinking. The United States can't afford to be the world's policeman anymore. The Europeans are going to have to take over their share, as Mr. Trump says. But they can't do that. They have been living under the cheap umbrella of the United States. If they have to raise money now to defend themselves, they will either borrow huge amounts at a time when that's a risky proposition, or they'll have to tax their people, or they'll have to end their social welfare systems in order to pay for the militarization. Germany is the key story here. And they're borrowing and they're cutting their safety nets. Mr. Merz said, the traditional welfare state we can no longer support. To which the answer is, and the same story is emerging in the U.S., if you can't support the traditional safety net for the mass of the working class, well, then the working class may withdraw its support from you. Left and right, the working class is doing that in Britain, in Germany, in France, in Italy. It's coming to the United States as well. Conclusion. The decline of the American empire is accelerating. And what you are watching from Washington is bluster, bullying, bravado. And all of it is designed to cover over the anxieties of those leaders who watch as every day confronts them with that which is becoming more and more difficult to deny. But don't be fooled. The reality is what you need to keep your eye on. The denials will fade soon enough. Thank you for your attention. And on behalf of Democracy at Work and the Left Forum, please share this video with others, and I look forward to presenting another Global Capitalism in November, our next scheduled time. Thank you.